The psychologist Dacher Keltner spent 20 years studying what happens to the human brain when it acquires authority, and his findings present a profound and unsettling paradox. He discovered that the very traits required to gain influence in a social group, empathy, collaboration, open-mindedness, are the exact traits that deteriorate once a person secures a position of dominance. Keltner found that people at the top of social hierarchies often behave as though they have suffered a traumatic brain injury. Their capacity for empathy degrades. Their risk assessment becomes flawed. They operate from impulse rather than connection. This brings us to a fundamental truth about human behavior that we rarely confront head-on. We are going deep into the psychology behind people who abuse power, specifically those who target the disabled, women, the emotionally vulnerable, or anybody they believe they can dominate. We are dissecting insecurity, projection, superiority complexes, and how false beliefs about entitlement drive destructive conduct. This is not an exercise in making excuses for abusive individuals. This is about dismantling the architecture of their behavior so we can see it with pure clarity. A vast majority of individuals who abuse power are nowhere near as strong as they demand to appear. What projects as strength on the surface is almost always a frantic cover for profound insecurity underneath. An individual might posture as dominant, aggressive, controlling, or overtly cruel, but those characteristics are inextricably tied to fear. They fear being exposed. They fear losing status. They fear losing control. They fear being perceived as weak. They harbor a terror of being ordinary.
They realize, on some unacknowledged level, that they will not command respect unless they extract it by force. A multitude of these individuals simply do not possess the capacity to stand in authentic strength, so they fabricate the illusion of strength by suffocating the autonomy of others. Instead of engaging in the grueling work of building internal fortitude, they attempt to absorb power by making someone else feel small. Instead of confronting their own inner inadequacies, they behave as though the possession of authority inherently grants them superiority. But that compulsive need to dominate acts as a confession. It reveals severe internal instability. What exact species of insecurity fuels this conduct? One primary driver is a deep, unshakable fear of powerlessness. Certain individuals are terrified of feeling helpless, ignored, dismissed, or insignificant. When they manage to acquire any degree of authority, they immediately weaponize it. They overcompensate. They construct environments of rigid control because beneath the facade, they are sprinting away from the sensation of their own vulnerability. They operate under the delusion that if they hold the whip, they can never be the one bleeding.
Another potent insecurity is a pervasive sense of inadequacy. Some individuals secretly harbor the suspicion that they are not competent, intelligent, respected, or sufficient on their own merits. Consequently, they attach themselves to titles, institutional backing, social status, or the blunt instrument of intimidation to carry a sense of worth they do not genuinely generate from within. If they were stripped of their credentials and forced to stand on character alone, their foundation would crumble. Thus, they hide behind the shield of power.
To comprehend why people crave these hierarchical shields, we must look backward to the aftermath of the Second World War. In 1950, the sociologist Theodor Adorno and his colleagues published a monumental study titled The Authoritarian Personality. They were trying to decipher the psychological underpinnings of fascism and the mechanics of widespread prejudice. Adorno proposed that authoritarian tendencies do not emerge from a void. They are cultivated. He suggested that individuals raised in strict, punitive environments, where obedience is demanded and emotional connection is scarce, develop a rigid adherence to conventional values. They internalize a profound submission to authority figures above them, while developing a venomous aggression toward anyone they perceive as being below them. This dynamic creates a personality structured around hierarchy rather than shared humanity. The anger and frustration generated by a punitive upbringing cannot be directed at the powerful parents or the oppressive system, because doing so carries too much risk. The child, and later the adult, feels powerless against the giant. Therefore, that internalized rage undergoes a process of displacement. It is redirected toward weaker or marginalized groups. Adorno designed the F scale to measure these traits, finding that those who demanded rigid conformity were highly likely to exhibit hostility toward outsiders. They view the world in stark binary terms: strong versus weak, superior versus inferior. This historical lens is vital when we analyze the modern abuser of power. They're often reenacting a script of domination because they possess no other framework for existence.
If a person internalizes the belief that the world is a brutal hierarchy where you are either the boot or the neck under the boot, they will fight to the death to ensure they are the boot. They rely on societal hierarchies because independent, critical thought requires a strong, secure ego, which they lack. They demand conformity because any deviation from the norm threatens the fragile architecture of their worldview. Their hostility toward the vulnerable is not a sign of their innate power. It is a symptom of their arrested development. They punish the weak because the weak represent the vulnerability they are desperately trying to annihilate within themselves.
This mechanism of annihilating one's own vulnerability brings us directly into the mechanics of psychological projection. In 1894, Sigmund Freud introduced the concept of projection as a defense mechanism, a theory later refined by his daughter, Anna Freud. Projection occurs when an individual unconsciously attributes their own unacceptable thoughts, feelings, or motives to another person. It acts as a psychological safeguard, shielding a fragile ego from the crushing weight of discomfort or anxiety. Rather than confronting their own challenging emotions, a person externalizes them. They shift the unbearable burden onto a target. Consider the mechanics of this process. A person who feels fundamentally weak will accuse someone else of weakness. A person who acts with manipulative calculation will obsessively claim that others are conspiring against them. A person suffocating under internal shame will dedicate their energy to shaming the people in their vicinity. This is why abusive individuals are engaged in a relentless narration of other people. They operate as obsessive commentators, attempting to define their targets as unstable, dangerous, incompetent, overly emotional, or unworthy. If you listen closely to the accusations hurled by an individual abusing power, you are rarely hearing an accurate description of the victim. You are listening to a distorted autobiography of the abuser. They are vomiting their own unresolved fears outward because containing those fears would require a level of self-reflection that might shatter them. Projection allows them to maintain a socially acceptable self-image, at least in their own minds. It permits them to evade accountability. By deciding that the darkness resides in the other person, they grant themselves permission to punish the other person, thereby symbolically punishing their own flaws without ever having to take ownership of them. The target becomes a mirror reflecting the abuser's own rot. But rather than clean themselves, the abuser attempts to smash the mirror. We must now wade into a highly complex, shadowy area. We must distinguish between psychological defense mechanisms and actual clinical pathology. It is a common reflex to observe someone inflicting massive harm, acting with profound cruelty, and immediately label them as mentally ill. But that reflex is flawed. A person can inflict tremendous devastation and still fall far short of the criteria for a diagnosable mental disorder. Harmful behavior and mental illness are not synonymous. A mental disorder typically involves a clinically significant pattern of dysfunction, deep internal distress, or a tangible break from reality. How do we differentiate cruel ideology, abusive conduct, and rigid bias from psychosis? The brutal reality is that a person can be manipulative, oppressive, morally bankrupt, and anchored in reality,
They might know exactly what they are doing. They operate with calculated strategy. They ensure their own social protection. They choose their victims selectively, hiding their behavior from those who hold power over them. This calculation proves they are not detached from reality. It proves they are manipulating reality to serve their own ends. We must confront the concept of the banality of evil, articulated by the philosopher Hannah Arendt. In 1961, Arendt reported on the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the primary architects of the Holocaust. She expected to encounter a demonic monster. Instead, she found a disturbingly ordinary man, a bureaucrat, a man who was at peace with himself. Arendt concluded that Eichmann's capacity for evil did not stem from clinical madness or a sadistic personality disorder. It stemmed from a complete and catastrophic failure to think. He had stripped himself of the habit of moral reasoning.
He handed his conscience upward to the hierarchy, adopting the rules of the system as his only moral compass. He was not mentally ill. He was a loyal functionary who stopped experiencing moral questions as relevant to his own life. This is the shadow side of our discussion. Some of the worst abuses of power do not come from a broken brain. They come from a quiet, deliberate, and sane refusal to engage one's own humanity. To understand how this refusal functions in daily life, we need to visualize the environment the powerful construct around themselves. Keltner conducted a fascinating experiment to measure perspective taking. He asked subjects to draw the letter E on their own foreheads. A person who is grounded in empathy will automatically draw the E backward from their own perspective so that a person facing them can read it correctly. Keltner found that individuals primed with feelings of high power were much more likely to draw the E forward, rendering it backward and illegible to anyone else. They were neurologically locked inside their own perspective. Think of this as the emperor's armor. When a person builds their identity on dominance, they construct a fortress that actively repels reality. They surround themselves with compliance. They demand environments where their perspective is the only perspective permitted to exist. Over time, this creates a psychological echo chamber. When you never have to accommodate the emotional reality of another human being, the mental muscles required for empathy simply atrophy. This is why their reaction to any challenge is disproportionate. When a vulnerable person pushes back or simply insists on their own dignity, it does not just threaten the abuser's argument, it threatens the entire architecture of their constructed reality. They have built a room composed entirely of mirrors reflecting their own greatness. When someone shatters one of those mirrors by speaking an inconvenient truth, the abuser does not just feel insulted, they feel existentially threatened. They react with rage because they lack the emotional elasticity to absorb a reality where they are not the center. Their power has not expanded their world. It has shrunk their world to the exact dimensions of their own ego. This brings us to the cultural ripple effect of false superiority. When we examine vast systems of power, such as white supremacy, patriarchy, or institutionalized classism, we find the same psychological mechanics operating on a macro level. Superiority complexes are masks worn over collective insecurity. This observation does not minimize the devastating, lethal impact of these systems. The harm is massive. But on a psychological level, the fervent need to insist on intrinsic superiority reveals a desperate fear lying just beneath the surface. It is the fear of equality. It is the fear of losing an unearned status. It is the fear that without an artificially constructed hierarchy, they would have to step into the arena and measure their worth honestly on equal footing. If an individual or a group requires a stacked deck to feel valuable, their sense of value is fundamentally void. This dynamic leads to a profound realization. We must ask how someone can violently demand the return of a status they never legitimately possessed in the first place. They are attempting to preserve a fantasy of entitlement.
They operate under the delusion that they are owed obedience, social priority, control over narratives, and control over spaces. But these privileges were never natural rights. They were manufactured delusions. When social progress challenges that false narrative, the dominant group experiences it as a profound loss. They claim they are grieving the loss of justice or order. But they're not grieving justice, they are grieving the erosion of an illusion. Their internal definition of fairness is warped, centered around maintaining a hierarchy that should never have existed.
This explains why people can speak passionately about their own perceived victimization while standing on the necks of others.
There is a specific trigger that activates the rage of the insecurely powerful. It is the presence of the authentic. Let us explore the insecurity of envy. Some individuals are deeply disturbed by the intrinsic qualities they witness in others. A target may possess resilience, unforced authenticity, emotional depth, natural beauty, fierce intelligence, or a quiet spiritual gravity. Instead of admiring these traits, the insecure abuser resents them. They attack the very qualities they secretly recognize they lack. Why does authenticity provoke such a volatile response? Because authenticity is a form of power that cannot be granted by a title, a uniform, or an institution. It cannot be bought, and it cannot be mandated. It is earned through the crucible of self-examination and emotional endurance. When a person whose entire identity rests on artificial authority encounters someone who stands in natural authority, the contrast is unbearable. The authentic person does not even have to speak to expose the fraudulence of the abuser. Their mere existence acts as a spotlight. If you have built your life on the premise that power equals domination, and you encounter someone who refuses to dominate but remains powerful, your worldview fractures. The abuser must attempt to destroy the resilient person to prove to themselves that their artificial power is supreme. They will try to exhaust the target. They will employ gaslighting. They will try to provoke a reaction to prove the target is unhinged. They are desperate to drag the authentic person down into the mud, because if the target remains unbroken, the abuser is forced to face the hollowness of their own soul. The utilization of institutional backing is the most common method insecure abusers use to amplify their reach. This is the technical mechanism of borrowed strength. An inadequate individual rarely attacks a strong target openly without having the system behind them. They require the weight of the institution, the cover of corporate policy, the shield of the badge, or the validation of the mob. They use these external structures to lend legitimacy to their personal vendettas. This is why abusive behavior thrives in rigidly hierarchical environments. The environment provides the plausible deniability the abuser needs to operate. They can frame their cruelty as merely following protocol or enforcing the rules. By cloaking their malice in the language of authority, they force the victim to fight a two-front war. The victim is not just fighting the abuser. They are forced to fight the entire apparatus that the abuser is hiding behind. This dynamic highlights the sheer cowardice at the core of the behavior. If the abuser were stripped of their title, removed from their corner office, and divested of their institutional armor, they would shrink into nothingness. They rely on the uniform to provide the courage their character lacks. They enforce compliance because they know they cannot inspire loyalty. They demand respect because they know they cannot earn reverence. The institution becomes a prosthetic limb for a crippled conscience. We must refuse to grant closure to this topic without examining its deepest layer. These dynamics extend beyond the social and the psychological. They penetrate the moral and the spiritual dimensions of the human experience. When a person dedicates their life to the domination of others, they initiate a process of internal decay. By viewing other human beings as objects to be controlled, obstacles to be removed, or mirrors to reflect their own ego, they sever their connection to the human family. Recall Hannah Arendt's observation about the eradication of thought. The refusal to engage in self-reflection is a spiritual death. To live a meaningful life requires the courage to look inward, to map one's own flaws, to sit with one's own inadequacy, and to strive for growth despite the pain of that awareness. The abuser of power refuses this journey. They barricade the door to their own soul. They choose the anesthetic of control over the friction of growth. Over time, this refusal hollows a person out. They become a shell, reacting defensively to every perceived slight, incapable of genuine connection, unable to experience true joy, because true joy requires vulnerability. They may acquire vast wealth, hold immense sway, and force the compliance of thousands, but they reside in a state of perpetual starvation. They are haunting their own lives. They project their darkness outward because if they kept it inside without resolving it, it would consume them. But in pushing it outward, they consume the peace of everyone around them. Understanding these mechanisms shifts the paradigm. When you fully grasp that abuse of power is frequently rooted in profound insecurity, you break the hypnosis of the performance. You stop mistaking aggression for fortitude. You cease confusing domination with legitimate authority. You realize that cruelty is not a manifestation of confidence. Cruelty is a glaring signal of fragility. The bluster, the control, the relentless attacks, they are the frantic thrashing of someone drowning in their own unresolved fear. Real strength operates on a different frequency. It does not require the terrorization of the vulnerable. It does not demand the projection of inner darkness onto an innocent target. It is unconcerned with false superiority. Authentic strength is quiet. It is grounded. It requires severe discipline. It demands rigorous honesty. A truly strong individual can confront the ugliest truths about themselves without needing to crush someone else to maintain their equilibrium. They know their worth, so they do not need to steal worth from others. When you encounter those who weaponize power, recognize what you are truly looking at. Beneath the titles, the aggression, and the distorted demands for submission lies a desperate evasion of the self. Your awareness is your armor. Keep observing the mechanics of human behavior. Keep refining your understanding of what true power is and what hollow performance looks like. Stay rooted in your own unshakable truth, because your presence alone is the counterweight to their illusion. Share this dialogue with someone who is navigating these dynamics so we can all walk forward with clear vision. Keep your eyes open. Keep your spirit sharp. Keep speaking truth.